collaborate both with the Australian and the Polish illustrated. Today it will be a continuation of our lecture, but to gain the sense of continuity, which will make it not only boring, but also to possible peace, or the rotten in the hands of the American president and peacemaker Donald Trump. I have to make a few, the story so far, comments to bring you, but to avoid a repetition, this story so far will be in a slightly different angle, with a different angle, sociological angle, a big picture, and explanatory. So the three lectures aim at explaining why war and peace in Ukraine has been taking a shape it does. If I left it as a complete commentary, we might miss some optimistic tones, okay? And I would love to highlight the basis of this optimism in a more theoretically grounded way. So it's not just my opinion or opinion of observers who are sympathetic to the case of Ukraine, but it's more grounded. So the three lectures will cover three aspects of the explanation. In social science, very often explanation takes two forms to satisfy our curiosity. Historians usually hear a story of events one after the other, one following the other. Sociologists do it slightly differently, incorporate historical picture, but first ask for a big causal chain to explain by referring to systemic arrangement, to circumstances seen from the bird's eye view. And second, they add to it to satisfy even more your curiosity in asking question why it happens that way, by pointing to the motives and intentions of the key actors. Okay? And in this case, there are three groups of actors. One around Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader. We'll call them siloviki, using the Russian name for the uniformed services, highly militarized. Second group is people around Vladimir Zelensky, who are very interesting, evolving Ukrainian elite, that is, people of power, and whom Zelensky restructured in a very interesting and hopeful way. And third, I have to mention Donald Trump and his current peacemaking elite in America, because all three actors will determine the shape of the peace which will follow this war. So should we be optimistic or not? Well, in the short run, probably it will be a rotten peace, but it might save the most important thing, sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, which allow it to choose its own preferred path of future development. And it starts by saying, why do we have this war and peace, very dramatic, bloody, and extremely damaging events in Eastern and Central Europe. Because Russia is an empire which is entering the stage of collapse and fragmentation. It has been lasting since about 1917, the end of the First World War. Russia first took a defensive restructuring as a Soviet Union, tried to avoid inevitable collapse, and I'll explain in a moment why collapse of the empires is inevitable. It happens always for two reasons, which I'll spell out. And then transformed itself and is involved in the rearguard, backlash action directed by Putin to prevent or to delay its inevitable fragmentation. So why do empires inevitably collapse by fragmenting? And either they produce nation states, independent nation states, like Ottoman Empire, British Empire, French Empire, German Empire, etc., etc. We had many of them. 7 of them started collapsing more or less at the same time with the end of the First World War. Why do they inevitably collapse? There's 2 reasons which allow us to understand why empires are inherently unstable, especially in the later stage of their development. When they expand, they are safe. When they start collapsing, when they stop expanding, they start collapsing inevitably, like a Roman Empire. Okay, we are all remember the main developments in the Roman Empire. It stopped expanding and started a painful process of fragmentation, out of which many entities emerged. In modern times, such entities, like in the case of the British Empire, form commonwealths, that is, voluntary associations, which coordinate more or less overall policies of the participants without impinging upon their sovereignty, their freedom, their rights to determine their own development. Or nation states, like the Ottoman Empire, which started collapsing after the First World War, and it's still in the process. It's a Kurdish question there. Remember, not all nations manage to detach themselves from empire. But why do nations want to detach themselves from empire? And now we come to these 2 explanatory points which I would like you to keep in mind, because we'll be alluding to them throughout our lectures. First, because empires have a hierarchical and very centralized structure. Empires, especially the Russian Empire was in many sense unique because it was post-Byzantine and post-Mongol. It developed out of this line of development leading through Muscovite Principality, which was for over 2 centuries under the Mongol yoke, and inherited from that time many elements of this social structure and political culture, which persists still today, like extremely strong autocracy. The empires have to expand because the relations between center, in this case Moscow, and the peripheries is exploitative. They have to extract enough resources from the peripheries to fund the administration of the growing empire, and especially the costs of military supervision and maintenance of this empire, which grow. Why do they grow? We come to second important cause, that they grow because the peripheries evolve in the way which unleashes, starts strong nationalistic movements of independence and autonomy in their own interests, coming from populations, coming from all dimensions. Political, they want more self-determination. Military, they don't want to be under the yoke of the center. And cultural, which is most important, because nationalistic movements of national liberation and independence, build up new identity among the peripherals, which is no longer imperial identity. It's an identity which you can summarize in the phrase Ukraine for Ukrainians, France for French, Ireland for the Irish, in which they demand also cultural autonomy. Their own languages, if they don't have their own languages, at least their own cultural independence, independent from the center. So, nationalistic movements are the major movements of modern world. And they started to explode in the 19th century, and they contributed to the collapse of all major empires in a significant way. And now we don't need to understand why people want autonomy and independence. For modern person in particular, this is essential part of identity, aspiration. We want to be free. It's universal. Modernization is the process which increases our desire to be autonomous and free in all dimensions of our life, except that we know in modern nation states that we have to sacrifice part of this autonomy to secure stable social and political order. And that's natural. We all understand it, including the Ukraine. The Russian Empire collapsed in a very violent and extremely painful way, and it's still in the process of collapse. Okay. Still, the peripheries are under the yoke. They start detached. Ukraine, inevitably in future will be Belarus. Inevitably in future will be Georgia again. It tried twice, paid a big price. Inevitably Central Asia, like Uzbekistan is the first now on the list of countries which will detach itself. Kazakhstan, all the four stands, the Central Asian countries will inevitably detach themselves from the imperial supervision, which is from 1991 exercised under the misleading name Commonwealth of Independent States. It's not a Commonwealth. They are not independent, and they are not full nation states. They are client states, like Ukraine was, until its Maidan dignity revolution. So the Russian Empire was particularly vulnerable to this collapse, fragmentation, because it was most expansive of all existing empires. It had roots with Byzantine and Mongol cultures, which left behind terrible legacy of autocracy and social structure in which the rulers were detached from the rule in a dramatic way, without this intermediate strata which existed in other empires and made other empires to collapse in a less violent and brutal way. It always had a sort of president for life, I call it, emperor. Russia formally in 1720 declared itself imperial power and started expansion, most rapid under Catherine the Great, Prussian Princess Sophia, which made Russia the world leader in the speed of expansion. During the rule of Catherine, which ended at the end of the 18th century, 150 kilometers south a day it expanded. And they expanded in a particular way because on the agenda of expansion they put Crimea. They didn't manage fully, as you remember from history, the up and downs in the degree of control of Crimea. They managed to achieve full control of Crimea only in 1944, when Stalin expelled almost all, not original, but after Greeks, they were Tatars, the Mongols living in Crimea. He expelled them almost completely. Under Catherine, this started, and she ordered the scientists in the Academy of Science to go to Crimea and change all the names, erasing everything which was post-Byzantine, to stress that this is the extension of the original Russian Empire, original Byzantine Empire, Caesaropapist, in which the head of state, the head of army, and the head of religious cults are the same persons. Okay? In the Roman Empire, you might remember from history, the turn into imperial power was when the princeps, the head of state, become also imperator, the head of army, and Pontifex Maximus, which the Pope still carries this title, Roman Pope. But in the Byzantine time, he was married, so to speak, merged with the emperor. So Putin emerges as a man who tries to prevent the inevitable collapse. So the war in Ukraine really, if you study it in details, started not in 2014 with the attempt to take over Crimea, but at least 2 years earlier, when Putin started to rebuild the core of imperial power, that is economic dominance over peripheries. Okay. By imposing on Ukraine his scheme, which used to be called Eurasec, Euro-Asian Trade Zone, or Common Economic Arrangements. Okay? This is a mechanism of sucking the resources from the peripheries using the economic mechanism, which is less visible than the military domination and tax. Tax is very painful, it's a dentistry sort of extraction, full of pain. But economically, by manipulating terms of trade and the division of labor, you can equally well extract resources for the center, for Moscow with the periphery. But Ukrainians were already quite aware of it. And they opposed it. They said, no, we prefer instead the association agreement with the European Union, which offered them much better conditions of economic activity. The Russians, Putin, reacted very angrily. He immediately ordered the tariff war with Ukraine. They stopped import, and he started what Ukrainians called first chocolate war, especially the Swedes. Why the Swedes? Because they hoped to depose a very powerful Ukrainian oligarch and later the president, just before Zelensky, Poroshenko. Poroshenko was originally the sugar or sweet oligarch in Ukraine, trading with Russia like he was producing chocolate. So the Russians wanted to make it very painful for the Ukrainian elite by stopping importation of the sweets and chocolates, and it started various deals. They first succeeded, then did not succeed anymore because Putin wanted to extend it on all other goods. And it led to the what Russians called coup d'etat, the Maidan revolution, and what Ukrainians called a revolution of dignity. Because President Yanukovych in 2014 fell because he refused to fulfill his promise to Ukrainian people to join the European common market, the trade arrangements, rather than Russians. He was summoned as governors of provinces are to the imperial authority in Moscow and told, do it or else. And this else was quite clearly in Putin's mind, including the military intervention. So it was a prologue to the military invasion. And military invasion, I emphasize it to understand that it was a part of the imperial policies to prevent splitting in Ukraine. Politically splitting, militarily splitting, that is, providing its military forces to the service of the emperor in Moscow, and also in case of economic relations. But it didn't work. Ukrainians got rid of Yanukovych, elected by huge majority. Vladimir Zelensky, an outsider, who was very well educated, extremely capable, but he lacked political experience. So first he tried to negotiate with Putin, and he failed to negotiate with Putin because Putin thought that he is a puppet, that he's easy to manipulate, that Zelensky would not require strong measures. Why did the emperor Putin thought that way? Because of the unfortunate policies of the West, European Union and the United States. Appeasement policy. Europe did not want to intervene at the crucial time when negotiations between Zelensky and Putin started and were going badly. okay, they said nice words, encouraged Żeleński, but there was no sanction in 2014 which encouraged the emperor to move tough policy, to move the army, to punish Żeleński. Get rid of Żeleński and reintroduce Yanukovych. They keep Yanukovych in the freezer near Moscow, and his sons, and his lover, and hope that one day they may be to bring him back to Ukraine to lead this imperial domination in the economic, political, and cultural sphere, because Yanukovych was also opposed to the revival of the Ukrainian language, which is very difficult. So this illustrates very well this advance. But as I said, no one managed to stop imperial collapse. It's coded into these two instability spawning processes. First, very asymmetric relations of domination, economic domination, very bad for the period, always. And secondly, the rise of movements of dignity, national movements of national independence. So we know what happened later. Ukraine, I remind you here, emerged as country fighting for its unity, but under very difficult conditions. Ukraine was born divided after almost a century, practically, since 1654, the unfortunate peace with Russia, which nominated Russia as a protector of Ukraine, and Ukraine was in trouble because it was linguistically divided. The western part of Ukraine spoke Ukrainian, and they were very strongly pro-Western. The eastern part spoke mostly Russian, although the identity of people there was Ukrainian, but they were English-speaking, Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Like, we are not surprised that Ireland in the 20s emerged mostly as English-speaking Ireland. It was too late to save the Celtic Irish language. But it was not too late to save Ukrainian. It was a young language, very strongly rooted, especially among the agricultural strata. The Russification, which included linguistic Russification, affected mostly urban areas and in eastern Ukraine. Okay. But the Galician part, as it is called now in Europe, the part of Ukraine which was under domination of Polish Commonwealth, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, before it collapsed in 1795, and later after the war, Polish Republic. Ukrainians were very influenced. Remember, they took major institutions in the way which was very similar to the Polish solution. That is, republic with democratic governance. Okay. But they were very quickly quashed. So they emerged divided, and Żeleński had a very difficult task. Not only political defense, but also, to a significant extent, continuing nationalism without its dark anti-democratic side, and encouraging democratic nationalism. Nationalism which is, we did describe in sociology as civic nationalism, which is based on the pride not only of in ethnicity or own culture, but also in your own civil rights, democratic rights of all citizens. The attack was extremely brutal. We described it and went through it. And we come to current situation where Russia gained control over after ups and downs of 1/5 of Ukrainian territory, and starts its campaign. It was because they had enormous military advantage, and because the West, especially in Europe, started awakening to the danger of Putin. Too late, too long appeasement policy, too long sitting and doing nothing, sending nice statements of support to Zelensky, but doing very little. They started to send military help, financial help, but it was too late to stop this enormous, brutal Russian invasion. Extremely brutal. You've probably heard about Bucha, about war crimes. You probably heard about abduction of children by Russians. Mass abduction for which International Court of Human Rights charged Putin and his Minister of Ethnic Affairs, a woman whose name I forgot, with war crimes. They were conducting a genocide. The attacks were brutal because they were directed against civilian infrastructure. Okay. First, when the column of tanks entered Russia, they were stopped in a abrupt and very successful way by Zelensky deploying very well the anti-tank weapons, which was hastily provided to Ukraine. This Ukrainian army was formed almost out of nothing. Remember, in 1994, Ukraine voluntarily had to disarm itself. They were forced to sign the treaty in Budapest Treaty, with Russia, and pass all its nuclear weapons and big parts of the non-nuclear weapons to Russia. And who were the guarantors of the territorial integrity, which was signed by Putin to Ukraine? United States, Great Britain, France, and the three countries signed. Did they do anything? Did they feel obliged to take seriously the Budapest Agreement? Putin wasn't, and they were not too. Perhaps the explanation is they couldn't, they were too weak. Europe has been disarming itself for the last about 50 years. So the Cold War marked only a period where Europe was spending less and less on defense and security. So suddenly they were caught with their pants down, facing the Russian brutal aggression without real capacity. The US sent about $180 billion aid, not 350 as Mr. Trump claimed, 182, which was extremely good and helped immensely to arrest Putin's invasion. But they did not stop brutality of this invasion. Enormous losses. Not only Bucha, not only war crimes, but destroying the biggest dam on the Dnipro River, which really harmed Ukraine and flooded hundreds of square kilometers. Putin's campaign also led to mass bombing of schools, hospitals, electric power plants, to blackmail Ukrainians that if you don't wave the white flag, will destroy you, and extremely damaging bombing of cities, especially Mariupol. I haven't got pictures from Mariupol, but it looks like Gaza today. Annihilated. And of course, movement everywhere. Stop Putin and stop war. Not peace at every cost, but stopping the aggression. This is the only reasonable demand. Ukrainians showed enormous capacity to live under this brutal assault. They started rebuilding the industrial power, especially military. Now, I read in the penultimate Economist that they are the biggest producers of small drones in the world. Between 2 and 4 million a year they can produce, and drones became a very important weapon in this new urban-rural assault war. Ukrainians had support of military Americans and Europe. Europe provided about $140 billion aid. America 180, Europe 140, much less. And Europe started to divide. The old problem of European disunity. There are always some countries which don't want to pay for the common defense, which have less commitment to the liberal democracy which is defended, and which do not want to carry the cost of it. As you know, Hungary split. Well, Hungary leader Viktor Orban says, we are too dependent on energy supplied by Russia to object. Not true. Europe provides them with energy security. It's simply Mr. Viktor Orban has too many deals with Putin, and he's autocrat. He knows that in Hungary, which is part of the European Union, he won't stay as a dictator for a long time. But we are living in the era where popular dictators can rule. Okay? They can bribe population. Above all, they can mislead them using this new powerful weapon, that is disinformation carried by social media. It's terrible. Putin used it very well in his cyber war, and my third lecture will be devoted entirely to the new form of warfare, where military action on the front, is backed by cyber war in the form of disinformation, propaganda, and manipulation, especially of electoral processes, all over Europe. Europe is so disunited because Putin started supporting not left-wing, like Soviet forces in Europe, but extreme right. Extreme right. He quite rightly noticed that there is a backlash against liberal left policies and put his bet on the right-wing nationalists who are controlling the so-called populist movements, and now they are controlling many populist right-wing governments, which are almost inevitably sympathetic to Putin, don't want to carry the cost of common defense. It weakens not only democracy, but the capacity of the West to defend its core value commitments. So, situation is such. I'll talk about it later, but just mention that Putin financed Marine Le Pen and her movement, which changed names and became very pro-Putin. Only 2 days ago, she stated that she opposed Trump's imposition of a rotten piece of Zelensky in Ukraine. She controlled Alternative for Germany, the new movement now which spawned the second most popular party in Germany. The Social Democrat, CDU, the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats managed to control government in Germany only by forming a sort of emergency coalition to keep this almost openly neo-fascist and very strongly pro-Putin party. Putin used the immigration card very cleverly, in dividing European countries and undermining democratic governments. He prevented mass flow of refugees and would escape to Russia, okay? Even from desperate countries, few takers. Nevertheless, Russia was flooded by refugees and immigrants, but they stopped it in a very brutal way. But they started pumping those refugees, especially from countries which had very strong terrorist movements in them before they collapsed, like Syria, to Europe. And before Mrs. Merkel realized that it carries very high risks and that controlled migration is fine and strengthens all the country, but uncontrolled migration is a recipe for a disaster, for our political alienation, and for increasing risk of disturbance, terrorism, which starts to reinforce right-wing policies of the populists. Putin managed it because he used very skillfully the tools of interference in management, about which I will talk in some details later, not only in relation to Mr. Putin, but also in relation to Donald Trump. There is a strong, very long history of Trump contacts with the Russian authorities, with the Putin camps, which started even before the Soviet Union disappeared. In 1987, Mr. Trump, on invitation to then Soviet ambassador to US, he went all costs paid to Moscow and was treated there as royalty. But what is the situation now? And I would like to move earlier and move to the very bad outcomes of this assault. The costs of Ukraine are huge and growing. They are not as big as Russian costs. But remember, Russia has 140 million. And Russia, Putin sends to frontline as a proverbial artillery meat, mostly minorities. It was beautiful research done by a medic from, I think, Britain, who went and counted, went to hospitals in the middle. It was probably 2023, and counted the victims of war. And there was Bashkirs, Kazakhs, Chechens, Uyghurs, very few Russians. First, Putin threw to front the prisoners. He got rid of criminals and offered them indemnity from prosecution in war. Then minorities. He started using the European, Russian minority on the front, but mostly in the position of command, not front soldiers. He started importing North Koreans, about 10,000 of them are already imported. He started a military draft in Asian countries, in Nepal, India. Many of those people were told that they are going there as car drivers, lorry drivers, and ended up after 2 weeks on the front line. He started also drafting all sorts of Caucasian minorities who provide him sort of almost slaves, like Chechnya, after virtually trampling down Chechnya. So he still does not use the population in Moscow and Petersburg, who are privileged, and if the pain started to be felt there, he might generate much more opposition. But above all, he started murdering critics and opponents. Like Stalin, without any respect for laws or even moral principles, which in politics still are universally maintained, except for Mr. Putin and some African, probably despot or Asian despot. The list of people who were poisoned, and it was sort of industrial work. They were poisoned by Novichok, which only Russian can produce. So it was quite clear who poisoned. If they were not poisoned, they were shot, like Mr. Nemtsov, a very strong candidate. Some avoided them, especially oligarchs who were arrested, like Khodorkovsky. He ran, at the beginning of Putin's rule, the largest oil and gas concern. And he was arrested when he declared that he wants to stand for presidency. He was arrested on trumped-up charges, in prison, tortured, And only 10 years later, his mother managed to buy him out and they stripped him of all his wealth and distributed it to Putin's oligarchs. Talk more about the structure of Putin oligarchy. So, murders were part of the Putin's campaigns. Journalists, influential journalists like Politkovskaya was poisoned. And everyone probably watched the Oscar-winning film about the death of the very successful candidate, whose name just escaped me? Navalny. Alexei Navalny. It was a short film which provided the evidence of Putin's poisoning of Putin's FSB, secret police, poisoning Navalny in front of everyone's eyes, even without hiding. Probably all of you heard about Skripal. Even those who retired and wanted to leave were poisoned. Putin never forgives. As he said, all traitors must die. So it was a war which was fought on many fronts. The cost for Russia is estimated between 500,000 and 600,000 soldiers. And probably some of them would be civilian. In Ukraine, about 30% of victims are civilians because they bomb and destroy the civilian infrastructure. And it's estimated about 300,000 to 400,000. Neither country would publish the data on victims. There are estimates done by external agencies. Ukraine lost not only of this 400,000, but also 5 million of refugees who left Ukraine. And now I saw yesterday saying that it's close to now 8 million, which is devastating. Russia, Ukraine lost about 50% of its industrial productive capacity, which Ukraine already rebuilt. It's remarkable how they recovered very quickly. Russia has to spend, we don't know how much they will have, not by war directly, but by sanctions. But I have some doubts about the effectiveness of the sanctions. They can be very badly evaded. And now spend between 30 and 35% of its GDP on military, on war, on military equipment and maintenance of the army. But the worst thing that happened in Russia before we moved to Ukraine, which suffered much more, the worst thing that Putin managed to transform a Russian society into militarized society. Very few societies in history are transformed that way. He made the military the core of his Siłowiki, the ruling group. Most of its members are either military or militarized. He extracted from all oligarchs enormous resources. They have to pay to the center so the empire can save its periphery by using the resources, subordinated the economy to war. It's a war economy now in Russia. They produce very few civilian goods of any value. And if they export military equipment. They pay to North Korea, to China, and to Iran, which sends them Shahid, very dangerous drones, in military equipment and expertise. So this is very dangerous and subjected the population to such powerful disinformation and propaganda pressure that the Russians can hardly be blamed. They have no alternative sources of information. And they are punished. You can get 8 years of prison camp if you call the invasion of Ukraine a war, not special military operation. He bowdlerized the language of description, preventing people from realizing that what happens in Ukraine is brutal assault to the nation, which destroys its not only its infrastructure, industrial and military, but also political infrastructure, the independent state. And it's an assault on culture because Putin's formula of aggression on Ukraine is denying the very existence of Ukrainians and independent Ukraine. Says, and he repeated it many times. Also, Mr. Trump, at least once, repeated this lie. There is no Ukrainians, there are only confused Russians. Ukraine, it never was an independent state. It was a Habsburg, small sort of protectorate, not an independent state. The Russians created Soviet Ukrainian Republic. That was a Russian. So it's an assault on culture, language, identity, politics, economy, the whole society. Therefore, the cost of it are monumental. And we can only admire that under such enormous assault, Ukrainians did not break, surrender, and or left the country, because it's terrifying. Modern wars have been civilized historically by establishing the rules of war from about the beginning of the 20th century. The end of the 19th century, more and more international laws protected civilians in war, protecting war crimes. Later, from 45, also the concept of war crimes and genocides were created in Ukraine, in Lviv, by Ukrainian Jewish lawyers. And they maintain the defense. Why they are so heroic and so tough? I would explain it in 3 ways. First, they have history of suffering. Okay? From the Holodomor, Stalin's artificial famine in 1933, which killed between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians, through terrible, almost 1 million of Ukrainians died. I'm sorry. Okay, I have to finish. Died in Great Purchase, and later during the war, if you hear that mostly Russians were dying, it's a lie. Turn to historians, best historians of the war, Norman Davis in his book Great War, or Tim Snyder, a and they will tell you that if you count, if you unpack Soviet citizens category of victims, 8 million Ukrainians died during the war, much more than Russians. I have to finish at this moment.